I wanted to start just by asking, and this seems like a self-obvious question, how many people here create things with technology on a daily basis? Right? Okay, so that's really the majority at this point of different design professions. And it got me thinking, because I obviously do the same thing, about the ways in which the tools influence what we're actually making. Right? So if you think about painting or you think about some of the typical arts themselves, it has this direct expressive relationship, right? You're able to create and make and respond. And when you actually look at the different ways in which artists have been creating, there's this reciprocal relationship in terms of what you're actually able to make. There's this level of intuition that comes out of the actual creative process itself. And in some ways, I have a theater background. I understand both performance and the different ways that people create through intuition. It made me really jealous. It made me understand that maybe there's something sort of missing about technology and how we're actually able to create, because you see these quotes over and over again about the relationship between the materiality of what you're actually creating and your own expressiveness itself. So, for example, this is Jonathan Winters, who's a very famous American comedian and who is essentially tasked with the creation of what's called improvisational comedy. And he's on this famous show with Jack Parr, and he was actually one of the only people who ever made the host laugh. And the reason is, every time he would come on, the host would give him a prop, in this case a small stick, and he would just go for like 8 minutes, for 10 minutes, for 15 minutes. You could not shut him off, and it was just joke after joke after joke. He turns from a flautist into, just the incredible ability to actually make out of nothing, seemingly, but your own imagination. And so, as we were actually thinking about this, we looked to contemporary options. And so this is Tina Fey. If you've heard of her, yeah, this is one of my favorites, right? It's amazing. And so in researching this, she had some amazing descriptions just of a rule set in terms of improvisational comedy, the act where you get onto stage with lots of people and you just start making things. And I thought I would share them because I think even for anyone working in a collaborative medium, this can be really, really effective, right? So the first thing is just start with yes. When you appear on stage with other people for improvisational comedy, no matter what somebody says to you or offers to you, you say yes. You engage with that. So someone says, we're here in the desert, or here's a clock. Then you build upon that, one to the next. The second is to make statements, right? It doesn't actually help to arrive on stage and to say things like, I wonder where we are, because that doesn't actually help anyone else around you. It's more important to say definitively, here we're actually outside of this business and we're going to go, and someone else can build upon that, right? So the ability to actually build in friction with your relationships when you're collaborating, I think, is really important. And then this last one we always are thinking about. There are no mistakes, only opportunities, right? It's not helpful to think of the constraints or the problems themselves as things that are getting in your way. They're actually things that you need to build upon. They're the specificities of the design challenge that you're facing right at that moment itself. But those are some of the obvious ways, I think, in which improvisation connects with creativity. I want to talk a little bit about the structures that build in rule sets, actually very similar to experimental jet set. It's amazing to follow them. The rule sets that actually allow you to make the work itself, right? So if you think about jazz, and in this case John Coltrane, I studied jazz when I was younger, and it was always the case that old jazzers would talk about the ways that the structure would work with the sort of freedom of improvisation itself, right? So if you think about the ways in which different songs that are played, the tunes themselves, in this case my favorite things, form this structure that then you play off of because people understand the song itself, and you're able to make different repetitions or change or modalities actually within the pieces themselves. And so I'm interested in that in terms of design itself, how you build a structure for creativity, not just structure versus creativity, but creativity through structure itself. And so I'm just going to go through a couple of quick projects just to introduce our studio so you have a sense of the context. We're a media design firm, so we make media installations for museums, for brands, for public spaces. We do both linear filmmaking as well as nonlinear. We work with a lot of different architecture studios. This is the Cooper-Hewitt National Design Museum, which we're designing in New York City with Dos Video Renfro. This is the Eisenhower Memorial, which we're doing with Frank Gehry Partners in Washington, D.C., just off the National Mall. So you get a sense that we work on a broad array of different technological platforms, but there's a lot of work in terms of storytelling and narrative that goes into the different engagements that we're creating themselves. A lot have to do with architecture and the ways that people move through space and time at the same moment, and how narrative essentially overlaps those pieces themselves. This is a piece that we did for GE in 2009. This is a new piece that hasn't been announced yet, but I just thought I'd show a little sketch. This was at the top of the World Trade Center for the One World. This is a huge, we call it Stargate internally as a joke. But that just gives you a range of the type of work that we're making. I'm just going to show 4 very, very simple projects. The first one has to do with seeing. This is a project that we built for the Cleveland Museum of Art. If you don't know it, the Cleveland Museum of Art is one of the top 5 art museums in America and has this new wing that it's opened. Essentially doubled its gallery space. It's at the tail end of a $350 million expansion. But in the midst of that, a very visionary board member said to the institution, you know, we're not in Paris, we're not in Tokyo, we don't have a huge influx of tourists. If we're going to be expanding our gallery space, we need to also think about expanding our audiences. And so what they did was they started looking to technology, and we got involved to think about how to literally reinvent some of their galleries around the ideas of technologies themselves. This was actually the first inspirational image that we put forth to the client that got them to move from concept into actual production, to essentially engage with building something like this. And the reason, I think, is, and I think a lot of institutions are facing exactly this dilemma, we obviously are in the midst of this giant digital revolution, and yet no institution, even as they know they need to embrace digital, wants to be the one that messes up the core of that institution, right? So whether you're MoMA or the Rijksmuseum, whether you're Tate, or whether you're even ExxonMobil or individual broadcast mediums, no one wants to get it wrong and to essentially bankrupt either the brand or the company itself over these new digital initiatives. In this case, art museums have a lot to lose. And I think when we originally argued and talked with the institution, we thankfully took a very modest approach and essentially said to the institution, look, the first thing you need to understand is you don't need to reinvent the art museum, right? Art museums are fantastic and amazing, and people have incredible experiences with them as they move through the galleries, having this direct relationship with the artworks themselves. So when we actually designed this, we walked into an existing scheme that had lots and lots of iPads all over the place. In fact, one per artwork directly in front of the artwork. We ended up recommending that they delete 80% of the screens, and they pull them away from the artworks themselves so you can have a direct relationship with the artworks, lowered them so you can see over them to see the artworks, and then made every single thing on that interface based on exactly what you're seeing. So it's really trying to amplify the experience of being in the gallery, not move you into another world or take you into another space. I think that's one of the key parts to our approach that actually kept the project, frankly, from being canceled, is that we said to them, look, we need to actually amplify people's curiosity about these objects that are directly in front of them. So when you're actually inside of the space, you can see if you select an object, it immediately puts it into its original context. That's the actual original space where that sculpture was made for in Japan. Just to go through a couple of other examples like that, because these are literally my favorite, right? That's where that original lion's head is from. And just the capacity to be able to locate these objects, right? That totally changes the way you think about tempera painting. Once you see that context, that larger piece. Someone actually just the other day described this as filling in the white space around the artworks within the museum, right? I think one of the reasons that these types of moves, that's the original castle that was made for, or this is Rodin's original studio, right? It's an amazing factory for human expression. I mean, one of the things that we were very conscious of is the ways in which you can't actually try to introduce a new language beyond the curators. The curators are still interpreting the work, so that's Picasso when he invented Cubism. But what you really want to do is essentially provide a new way for people to understand these artworks themselves. The next one I'm going to show is even more next generation, probably one of the crazier ideas we've had. This is actually a facial detection algorithm. So we developed this so that as you make different facial expressions, it brings forward different artworks with the exact same location. Thank you. So it takes these images and makes these connections and these relationships. It totally changes the gallery, obviously, right? Because you end up with this performative space. And just the ability to actually amplify the way in which people are making this emotional relationship with these artworks themselves. This came out of just early conversations with the curators around the nature of empathy, right? That's literally what portraiture trades on, is our human capacity to look in the eyes of someone else and to make that connection one to the next. So this ability to basically take ideas and turn them into interfaces is a lot of what we're doing. This came out of conversations with curators where I was saying, it's so hard. You go into an art museum and you're filled with you're surrounded by so many fantastic expressions of art. You forget that someone made these things. Someone created these actual things. And so this interface is something where you make something and then it shows you an artwork with the same shape embedded within it. We basically spent a long time matching up all of these core shapes and angles and individual visualizations inside the artworks themselves. This was made, obviously, for a children's gallery. The interface is very low. It's very unorthodox. It's 18 inches off the ground. But when we made this, and we were prototyping it, the curators were so engaged with it, we had to literally sort of tear them away and realize that we should make an adult version. So we have a grown-up version, and a grown-up version has information next to it, because I've heard that adults like information. That's what I've heard, at least. This next one is another idea that we came up. Actually, this came from the curators. They're saying, sort of lamenting, that when people look at figurative sculpture, they just look at the expression. They look at the materiality. They don't understand that the pose itself is the key to figurative sculpture. That's literally what the artist is basically expressing itself. And so in this case, it's sort of the opposite of the facial one. You choose an individual sculpture and then try and match it. What's funny is that within the actual interface, this is very typical, very typical. Within the interface, you see there's a percentage, and when you send it to yourself, people were complaining about the emails they were getting. We were worried that there was something technically wrong, but they were complaining because it didn't have the percentage in it, and they weren't getting credit. When they were forwarding it to their friends, they would email in front of it, I got a 95% on this one. They can share that one to the next. This is a piece that then you take throughout the entire museum, and it uses a lot of new technologies, I think, to really simplify your connection with what is surrounding you. So you can take a tour from the director. You can also take a tour from other visitors. It's also aware of where it is. So you can just point it at anything and actually get information about the artworks that are surrounding you. And then finally, this is another image recognition algorithm that we developed, where you just point it at a painting, and it'll actually point things out about that painting to you. Right? So a lot of what we're doing is basically taking these new technologies and translating them. We're not an engineering culture, but a design culture, translating them for these different institutions. This is probably the most signature part of the engagement. This is the first inspiration sketch for what we made called the collections wall. And it has all 3,000 artworks that are on display all at the same time. And I show this not because this is an early sketch, not because it was a great triumph when we first introduced it, but actually because it was a very painful process. This gets into the improvisational aspect. As designers, you'll probably empathize with this. We had what we thought was a really good idea, big wide screen. We're going to have all these different pieces on it, and we're going to be able to visualize all the different artworks from within the collection itself. You'll be able to click on and sort of open up an individual artwork itself, and then see the connections between the different artworks. This was like our first shot at a concept, and the client was really, really excited about how it was looking, but then there were some questions from our side about the interaction design, how people would use with it, and how you would tell the difference between one person here and one person next and one person next. So we came up with an alternate scheme after that, and we developed this piece, which has these different columns, right? And so you can see that it's a sort of flow of different artworks, and the different columns themselves represent where people are supposed to stand. And now, I'm sure that people who, particularly Experimental Jet Set, who work as a collective, lots and lots of arguments ensued. Well, I'm not sure that people would do this, and they probably wouldn't stand that way. And how would that actually work? So we decided to make a little prototype in terms of the software itself, and had this new piece that we called the wave that was moving throughout. And that seemed interesting. So then we went on to this piece, and this, you can see, still has those divisions in it. It also had the wave in it. It also had these larger pieces of artwork that were coming out. And I think if you're understanding where I'm basically going with this, this is in some ways the downside, the bad side, at least to our creative process at this time. Meaning we spent a lot of time, an enormous amount of time, generating tons and tons and tons of ideas. It's actually, embarrassing and humbling to say just how much energy we dumped into all of these variations and ideas. And in looking at it in hindsight, I think what happened was, because we are not just graphic designers or motion designers, we're interaction designers, we're trying to literally design behaviors, we were really designing in a vacuum, right? This may look unfamiliar to you. If you do digital, it's probably very familiar. This is called the waterfall process. I think it's also all the way back to sort of classical architecture, the straight design process, right? Like you have a strategic idea, and then you make a design, and you refine that design. Then you start to code it and make it, and then finally you test it and you deploy it. This is very, very typical for almost any digital shop in the world. The main problem with this process, I believe, is that it makes terrible work. right? Like, if you just spend all your time refining things before launching them and testing them once you've made them, without the capacity to respond to it, you're in deep, deep trouble. And so what essentially happened was, after literally months and months and months of argument and tension and conflict, trying to figure out all these interfaces, I just said, forget it. We're going to stop doing things on paper. Let's just build this thing. We have to immediately make a prototype that people can actually use. And frankly, we solved those core interaction problems literally in 15 minutes. Once we had this actually in front of us, it was very, very obvious, all the different solutions in front of us to basically shape the behavior of how people worked with the wall itself. And so that's a big part of what we're doing now, is essentially we call prototype first. So instead of lots and lots and lots and lots of planning, and then you do production, and then at the end you test and you cross your fingers like, I hope it's good, we actually put all of that production work up front, and we use prototyping as a creative tool. Right? If you're just testing with prototyping, you're missing what it's best at, which is actually to create itself. And so we built this prototype. We built another prototype. You can see we have lots and lots of, we're sort of very good at magical fake gestures. These like fake pointing at some fake digital pieces. So these are not expensive or exotic things to do. This is just a projector in a room or pieces of foam core. But we basically build this into our process itself, and it is both rigorous and challenging and labor-intensive, but we frankly believe that this is the only way to actually make good work. And then we continue to prototype throughout the actual deployment itself. So just to be clear, like the criteria that we use when we look at prototypes, because we had to actually write it out both to ourselves and to the client, what are we trying to do? What is a good prototype when you look at it? And so for us, first and foremost, it needs three things. The first is a touch of magic. Right? And this also seems self-obvious, but until you see something working, not just a picture of it, not just an idea, but the actual material substance, how is this media going to move and react to me as I move throughout the space, you don't get that moment of like, whoa, that is amazing. And that's literally what we want and what we aim for over and over again. And so much of our ideas end up on the floor until we get that. And that's what prototyping brings for us. I often say that there's nothing that will age faster than new cutting-edge technology. Right? Like when we have clients who come in and say, oh, I saw this new projector, we should use lasers. I mean, all that is great, and it is terrific to make new cutting-edge technologies and to use them in interesting ways. But the most important thing is that you actually try and make a point with it, that you have something that matters about it, that you're making some meaning out of it. It again seems self-obvious to say, but most technology is awash in its newness. I mean, I say, particularly to students, I say, to be frank, it's not super hard to be the first firm to do blank. Because there's all these firsts every day. There's new interfaces, and there's new engineering phenomenons that you can apply to the design world. It's just really, really hard to actually make meaning out of it. And if you do it right, and you actually make something that has meaning, that is what will age. I mean, I often say to clients, the thinnest flat screen is going to look like a toaster oven in a year or two, period. Like, that's just the reality of how it works. But if you tell an amazing story, if you really connect with people, or if you use this, what we call experiential learning, a way to actually engage and teach people something through experience, that is what people will age. That's what will age well, and people will return for year after year after year. Some of the original exhibitions in interactives by Charles and Ray Eames are still installed at the Boston Museum of Science, and they're brilliant, and they completely work, and they're amazing and engaging. No one would actually think that they're cutting-edge technology, but that is not what's important about them. They make a point, and they connect with people emotionally. That said, this is the final installation. This is a month before, and you'll see it's really different. Like, we radically recoded, actually, this look and feel all the way up into the end, and then worked with the curators themselves to actually make sure that the installation was working intuitively. We're, in some ways, very atypical of designers. We tend to, instead of, I think oftentimes designers sort of are worried that a client or that a test group will actually sully or water down their vision. And so they're anxious about bringing people in and inviting their opinion on the work itself. And that makes perfect sense in certain circumstances. But for us, because we're designing for the general public and we need to know that people can just walk up and use it, when we get clients who say, I've never used a computer, or I don't like these gadgets, it's like, great, I want you to use this thing. And if you like it, then I know that lots and lots of people will like it. And so this is the final piece itself. You get a sense of how it works. Essentially, it has these different subsets of the gallery experience, different pieces. And these are actually made algorithmically in this case, as well as this case, so different formal groupings. It essentially allows anybody to stand at the screen, so people can stand shoulder to shoulder. And when you select an individual artwork, it actually brings up a carousel a similar artwork. So French paintings of the 18th century might lead you into still lifes or might lead you into a specific color or a gallery. And as you're actually selecting individual artworks, it's saving it to the iPad. So you're essentially authoring a tour of the museum through this experience itself. Image by image and artwork by artwork, you're actually putting forth your own shape and understanding and interest within the institution. And then that tour can then be shared. So it's the beginning of thinking about the museum really as a platform, as a place for visitors to express their own opinions and to make their own experiences through all of the collection within the artworks themselves. Oh, that's very nice. Thanks. Thanks very much. So the next piece I'm going to show is for the Gates Foundation. I actually found this while I was moving some things from my parents' house. This is how people thought about education, actually, when I was a child, right? So you have the teacher who's saying lots of interesting things, and then you have the children who are simply there to record it, right? And that's how, that's not exactly how children work or how people work, right? I also, this is totally beside the point, but I found this. This is great. Isn't this great? I don't know. Anyways, that's a whole other lecture. When we talk about education and how people actually engage with different pieces of content, we use this phrase. And this is obviously, I think anyone who works in technology will recognize these types of ideas, the way in which an active mind or an engaged form of curiosity is the best way and the most effective way to get people to actually understand something. But this is actually not a new idea. This is from Confucius. This is from 500 BC. And we feel that this is core to how humans work, period. Right? This ability to be curious and this drive to experience something directly, to not have an abstraction, but to actually experience it, to know it, to feel it. It's literally in our DNA. It's how we work. There's a psychological term called confirmation bias, which means that humans are constantly looking to confirm what they already know. And it creates this feedback loop in terms of what you've seen influences what you then think of the world, then influences how you see things. Anyways, in this case, anyone know what this is? Does it seem familiar to anyone? This is the first microscope, created apparently in the Netherlands in the 1500s, for just seeing the world in a very, very different ways. Now, in this engagement, which is funded by the Gates Foundation and then the Federal Department of Education, it's interested in using cell phones, so the sensors that are in cell phones, similar to the microscope, essentially using it to see the world in a very different way. And the subject is middle school physics. So very, very simple Newtonian physics, the ways that gravity works, the way that acceleration works. And as we were thinking about it, we thought, it's so funny because kids are probably sitting bored in the classroom looking at these types of algorithms and these different types of pieces of math, but not realizing when they run outside onto the playground, they're literally enacting those exact same ideas and algorithms on their own bodies. Right? Like playgrounds are essentially places to enforce mass, friction, and acceleration on yourself. And so what we did was we made this piece. This is a piece of hardware that has a series of different accelerometers and sensors, and that allows kids to essentially measure all of those forces and learn all of those formulas as they're enacted on themselves, on their own body. Right? So this is a prototype that we did last summer. This was with the New York Hall of Science. And essentially, it is a series of different mats that you can pick up that have different, what are called quotients of friction. So they go down the slide at different rates, depending on how much heat they're generating. And then the sensors, based on how heavy the kids are essentially picking that up. So what you're doing is you're actually looking at kids who are doing physics experiments on themselves by playing on the playground. And that data set that they're building up will actually form the core of the curriculum that then they'll study inside the classroom itself. So these are different runs that's showing the potential and the kinetic energy, thermal energy, the different ways in which energy is transferred throughout them going from the top of the slide to the bottom of the slide. And that then is used actually when they go into the classroom, right? So they have these interfaces that are built on top of those data sets themselves. And so just to show you, then you can go into the formulas and change the different numbers inside of them. So you can change, you can basically rerun, so that's the actual same data that they experience on the playground itself. And then you can rerun the individual pieces and manipulate the individual data points within that formula to understand it that much better. So you can change the height, you can change the mass, you can make them skinnier. If you get too heavy, you turn into a robot. Robots are very heavy. And then you can start to abstract. So it's a whole different way of learning. It's going directly from the experience itself and then all the way out to the equation itself. Instead of memorizing an equation and just sort of blindly applying it to a reality that you may not understand, you start with the reality that you know. You already know a lot about mass and friction and acceleration. You just don't know that you know it. It sort of builds on top of that. And this is all part of, amazingly, an experiment done by, again, the US government about the future of textbooks and the future of learning itself. So, thanks. So I'm going to show just two more projects I know that. One is probably the biggest engagement that we've done so far, the 9/11 Memorial and Museum. So we've been involved, first off with the museum and then with Memorial for, at this point, over 8 years. We did the original master plan for the museum in partnership with an exhibition firm, Think Design. And then in the process of doing that, we ended up designing all of the media, and now we're producing all the media. The museum opens this spring, so it's very exciting. And in the midst of that, we also got involved with the memorial. One thing you'll see here, this is actually the original slurry wall, as they call it, that is the foundations of the original building that withstood the Hudson River for the full year as they excavated after 9/11 itself. And you can see this is from a year ago, before the construction was finalized. But the site itself is incredibly raw. And particularly for a relatively young country, certainly in comparison to Europe, we don't have a lot of archaeology, but it feels very, very raw and archaeological. And so in our original approach, we really wanted to make something that had that level of rawness, of authenticity to it. We also saw that there was a big challenge for that institution. And the challenge can be boiled down to kind of two opposite types of visitors. On the one hand, you will have at the opening, when we open in May, 15-year-olds, so young adults, who literally know nothing about the event, right? They were 2 or 3 when it happened and don't have any type of first-person experience with it. And then on the other hand, you have survivors, almost 10,000 people who ran out of the buildings themselves, who literally made history on that day, who arguably know more about the event than any curator could ever know. And so we always saw that this was the biggest challenge for the institution. How do you bring together this incredibly diverse audience? And you know, lots of projects say that everyone is the audience, but I think in this case it's actually accurate. They really, even as we broke it down into lots of segments, are telling a story literally for everyone, which in some ways has to do with the shape of the event itself, just the fact that it was such a global moment of witness. So to do that, we came up with this idea about the museum as a platform where people could actually tell their own stories about 9/11 itself. This is actually the first piece that we ever made for them. We made this in 2008. And it's essentially a global call for stories about 9/11. There's photos and videos and written stories, and people basically sharing what happened to them on that day, which gets overlaid between the past and the present. So you get these photos of the past, you get Google Street View of the present constantly being updated, showing that double vision of sort of where we are today, of the past and the present in history and current events. And that coupled with this story booth, it's the simplest story booth that we've ever made. You go into it, it's in 6 different languages, and we invite people in any language to just locate themselves on a map and talk about what happened to them on that day, how they experienced 9/11 itself. And that was really a core part of that experience of 9/11, was the sharing and the connecting between people in terms of what happened on that day. So when you go into the museum itself, it's actually really, really unorthodox, but the first voice you hear won't be a historian. It won't be a curator. It'll literally be from other visitors telling you their 9/11 story. Right? And this is, as you can imagine, something of a really, really radical notion for an institution. And if you can imagine a site like 9/11 and a project like the 9/11 Memorial Museum, this is a highly politically charged commission. This is not an easy institution to put forward, say, radical ideas for. Even as they're very, very smart and very hardworking, it is a very, very tough place to make any work that is unconventional, right? So in this case, we had this idea. They softly embraced it. They thought it might be interesting. But again, we use prototyping. But in this case, we use prototyping essentially to engage the client in the idea itself. So this is the first prototype we made. This is like a 1-to-4 model in our studio that people could walk through, and we did projections and started to do the voice. And the client basically workshopped with us, and then they brought in the head of the foundation, and then they brought in the curators, then they brought in people from the state and from the city. The number of people who made their way through this, allowing them to both test, but also, interestingly enough, to build a stake in terms of the project, was really, really amazing. So it wasn't something where we built it and we just sort of crossed our fingers. We made it with the client so that they had buy-in, and then they started pushing people through it, and that actually is what built enough momentum. I'm now going to show just another mock-up that we did at our fabricator. So this is from 2 years ago, but you'll get a sense of what it's actually going to be like.
On the day of September 11th, 2001.
On September 11th.
September 11th.
September 11th.
So 11 September,
I was in Honolulu, Hawaii.
I was in Cairo, Egypt.
Bureau des Champs-Élysées à Paris.
In college at UC Berkeley.
I was in Times Square.
de São Paulo, do Brasil.
Estava em Miami, Florida.
It
It was probably about 11 o'clock at night.
I was driving to work at 5:45 local time in the morning.
We were actually in a meeting when someone barged in and said,
Oh my God, the plane has just crashed into the World Trade Center.
trying to frantically get to a radio.
When I heard it over the radio,
Heard it on the radio. I got a call from my father.
The phone rang, woke me up. My business partner told me to turn on the television.
So I switched on television.
all channels in Italy were displaying the same thing.
The Twin Towers.
And you move from that space into here. So that, again, is the slurry wall. That piece in the middle is called the last column. It was the last piece of steel excised from the site itself. And then throughout the experience, we use that same technique of these overlapping oral histories, these memories, these ways in which, again, you don't have a historian giving you the top-down view, but you get a sense from the bits and pieces of recall what actually happened on that day itself. Finally, when we get into the moment of reconstruction, this is actually them taking all of the pieces off of the site itself. So that's a beam over there. And for every single victim's family, they took out either a Star of David or a cross for the individual family itself. That piece there is a trident from the original exoskeleton of the building. And we had this idea of projecting directly onto the trident. And what we wanted to project, again, were these memories and these individual clips to give people a sense of what it was actually like on that day. These are people excavating. From the site, it's all from the first-person point of view and giving you a sense of what that experience was like. This also was an idea that we had and that we used prototyping for, but in this case, the client actually didn't like the idea. They told us from the beginning, look, we think it's a cheesy idea to project onto these artifacts. But we went out to this airplane hangar. This is actually at JFK Airport, 3 football fields filled with steel from the original wreckage, and it only makes up about 1% of the steel itself, and set up a mock-up to essentially give them a direct experience of what it would be like to project onto the trident. And what was interesting is that once we actually saw it on the actual steel itself, suddenly it made the argument to the institution directly. And in the words of the director, she said it felt like the spirit, almost like the memories of that steel was actually coming forward. And it really changed how she thought about it. And suddenly she turned around the whole approach to that exhibit and brought this forward. And it was interesting for us because, you know, one thing that I'm obviously not showing you are the literally dozen other prototypes that were failures, right? And that's okay, because when you're making failures, that's how eventually you get to something that is effective, and that's an actual solution that you're going to like, right? So making something, instead of trying to argue with our clients, instead of trying to even talk to our clients, oftentimes, particularly for 9/11, we would just make things, and we would stop trying to argue with them and say, we're just going to make it. If you like it, we'll do it, and if you don't like it, we're going to make something else for you. And again, it's really like a highly unfun way to work, because most of your work is on the cutting room floor, so it's super inefficient. But at the end, you do end up with something that you actually like. This is the last piece within the museum that visitors experience. And it came out of conversations with the museum where we talked about the post-9/11 world, this idea that 9/11 is neither history, nor is it really current events. It's actually in the process of becoming history. And what that process looks like, at least in our mind, is literally all the conversations that will happen inside, outside, before, after, and during the museum. So these kinds of questions, right? Like, how can a democracy balance freedom and security? This is very much on our minds today with the NSA and all the global spying that's happening. Even these very simple questions, like, how could 9/11 have happened? How did the world change after 9/11? These are what I call the unanswerable questions around 9/11. These are literally the pieces of the event that you can't ever resolve. But it's actually the conversations about those questions that mark what the post-9/11 world is. Now, when we started the project, the museum was very, very concerned about bringing controversy inside the museum. They said, you know, this is a memorial museum. This is there's enormous weight on the institution to honor the victims themselves. It's not a place to have heated political and unconstructive debates and arguments. And we essentially argued to them that there was a higher role, I think, for the institution, that they could engage with these types of political arguments in a way that was constructive and that didn't pretend that they didn't exist. And so this piece came out of those conversations with the institution, and as they evolved their approach to essentially what would be called crowdsourcing with the Make History project, with some of these open source ideas, we got them involved with this, which is essentially an exhibit where we're going to ask visitors about these core questions and record their answers. How do you hope our political leaders have learned from 9/11 is a question that all of us would certainly be thinking of during the museum itself, and having a moment to reflect and to add your own voice, I think, is important. And then we mix those voices with political leaders, right? So this is Colin Powell, who is the Secretary of State. This is obviously Bill Clinton, President of the United States, with different family members, with different pieces of the sort of stakeholders, the powers that be around 9/11 itself. And we use that to essentially frame the post-9/11 world, that it's a place where all of us are in conversations about these very, very hard questions. And all of us are looking for answers and seeking them between ourselves. And so the museum has an active and hopefully productive role within those conversations themselves. And this is the piece that basically puts that forward. So as I'm talking about the audience and essentially collaborating with your audience to tell a story, I wanted to end with just a quick clip that we put together of some of the voices themselves and the types of stories that can happen when you're not telling the story, but you're making a platform that allows everyone to tell their own story.
9/11 was not just a New York experience.
It is something that we shared, and it's something that united us.
And I knew when I saw that, people who were there that day, who immediately went to help people known and unknown to them, was something that would pull us through.
All the outpouring of affection and emotion that came from our country was something really that will forever, ever stay with me.
Still today, I pray and think about those who lost their lives and those who gave their lives to help others. But I'm also reminded of the fabric of this country, the love, the compassion, the strength, and I watched the nation come together in the middle of a terrible tragedy.
Oh, thank you. So in the midst of doing the museum, I got a funny call from the head of the foundation. So the foundation is both building the museum as well as the memorial at this point. This is about 2 or 3 years before the memorial was completed. And the head of the foundation just called me on my cell phone. He said, you know, I had this funny question, and I had heard a little bit about the way that the names are arranged on the actual memorial itself. So just to orient you, this is one of the 2 towers, or one of the 2 locations of the original towers, now taken up by a fountain designed by Michael Arad and Peter Walker. And the actual parapet is made and lined with all of the individual names themselves. The fountains have these very, very beautiful and elegant falls that go down to a level and then disappear into a lower level. The head of the foundation called me and said, you know, we have all these names that we need to arrange. Would it be possible to actually think about how to put them together in a way that isn't just alphabetical or chronological? And essentially what was happening was there was a big political argument and controversy around the panels themselves. Michael Arad, in his original vision, had all of the names totally randomly. And he really wanted to be a statement on the nature of terrorism, right? This is not a war memorial. This is not a place that people signed up for to be at that moment of tragedy. They were simply at work at that day. And so that became a challenge because it is a little more complicated than that. First responders, firefighters, members of the police were there by choice and did literally sacrifice their lives. And so there was all these controversies and challenges between the design and the general community and the press. And so a really, I think, not just compromise, but almost transcendence between all of these different parties was represented. And that was essentially an algorithm that we authored with Jer Thorpe. And so what you're looking at is literally the algorithm. All the names are mixed up, but essentially all of these blocks are all the different groupings within those almost 3,000 victims themselves. So you have the different flights, you have different floors within the towers. And then what's interesting is those green lines, the light one between the different blocks of names, those are personal relationships. Essentially, the foundation went to all the next of kin and asked them, who would you like your loved one to be located next to? And when they had a match between the two, that became part of a database, and that database basically fed into our algorithm that arranged the names themselves within the parapet. And so when you go to the memorial, we also launched this piece of software that helps you to find and helps you understand how the memorial works. It first explains the general organization of the pools, the way in which they connect to the different flights and the different towers themselves. But then that organization also allows you to search. So in this case, you can search for Cantor Fitzgerald. That's the largest employer at the World Trade Center at the time. And you can actually see those different organizations and groupings within the memorial pool itself. And so as you make your way through and see the individual pieces, you start to actually also uncover the relationships, right? So Victor Wald and Harry Ramos, who is a head trader, literally met on that day. People coming down the stairwell overheard and then reported later that Victor Wald said to Harry Ramos, you know, I will not leave your side until we're all the way to the bottom of the towers itself. And so as those accounts went to the family members, they understood essentially what had happened on that day. And those messages then turned into both of them asking to be located one to the next, which is literally inscribed inside of the panels themselves. And I personally, just in the project, have had a number of experiences where, for example, I was at another conference talking about something else, and one of the ushers came up to me explaining that she was a family member, and she said, you know, she's obviously quite emotional. She just said, you know, like most family members, we didn't get anything back. This is where we go. And it was amazing when this was announced and we could go and see where my father's name was, because I finally had a relief to know that he was somewhere. He's like, but then I looked and all around him were all of his closest friends. And so inside of each panel are all of those relationships, one to the next, and that then is then revealed to people as they make their way through the memorial itself, understanding the deeper human connections within the memorial. Thank you. So I have one quick little thing at the end, just so that we end, because I think even that experience for me really, again, made me see that the emotion, the love, frankly, that you can put into these projects, particularly when you're dealing with technology, is so incredibly important. And so I wanted to end with this project. This is a project that we did with Bjarke Ingels in New York City. It was a sculpture that we made on commission for the Times Square Alliance. And it was essentially a love letter both to Times Square and to New York itself. Bjarke has moved his practice in New York, and he's in love with New York. And so we made this sculpture that essentially, as you touch the interface, it actually beats at the same rate as your beating heart. And actually, as you chain together more people, it beats faster and faster. So the more people that are coupled together, the faster the sculpture actually reacts to you. So I'm going to show one other thing. It's also totally embarrassing, but it'll give you some sense of what happens when you actually are able to build something that big. One of the things that we learned certainly from 9/11 was the ability to make a platform that engages so many different people. And it's actually really, really exceptionally hard to make something for lots and lots of people that has some value to it. As you get bigger and bigger and trying to satisfy more and more people, this is just this corny news contrast, but I mean, like, they end up doing this, right, like dogs. I mean, it's terrible. But this is basically what happens when you make something that big. They put dogs on it, they put the kids on it, but at the end of the day, you have something that is sitting within that big a stage that has the ability to make that emotional connection. And I think at the end, it is really, literally, the love that flows through what you're trying to do into your audience that is what is resonating and is what makes that level of impact. And with that, I will just say thank you so much.